Hi everybody, I'm Samantha Barry. I'm the editor-in-chief at Glamour, and I'm so happy to be here. Hi. Thank you, Secretary Clinton. I'm so honored to be here on what is a monumental day for France when it comes to reproductive rights, and a devastating month and a year for the US when it comes to reproductive rights. And we're going to talk about how reproductive rights are under attack, both here in the US, what's happening globally, which is probably a nicer story, with these three amazing women that have a lot of skin in this game. We've got Sara Casey, who's the Assistant Professor of Population and Family Health at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. She's also the Director of the RAISE Initiative. Thank you, Sara. Alexis McGill Johnson, who's the President and CEO of Planned Parenthood Action Fund, and Jennifer Klein, who's the Assistant to the President and the Director of White House Gender Policy Council. We're going to talk about what's happening here, what's happening at the White House, what's happening at the ballot box. But I just want to start with you, Alexis, to kind of set the scene of where we are in the US. The Dobbs decision in 2022 overturned 50 years of precedent, something that we care a lot about at Glamour. We've been deep in the archives looking at actually all the stories that were written around Roe v. Wade the first time around. And we've witnessed this all-out assault on reproductive rights in the US, which is maybe not surprising, but at least terrifying. What are you hearing on the ground? What are you hearing from patients? Can you set the scene for us in New York and those tuning in on the live stream?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's an honor to be here. I wish we were in France right now, celebrating the guaranteed freedom that they explicitly put into the Constitution today. You know, here in the States, it is incredibly dire for so many patients. We are, you've all seen the maps, 21 states now have abortion bans. That means 1 in 3 women and more trans and non-binary folks are living in states where they no longer have access to abortion care in state. It means that they are traveling, you know, significant miles out to get access care unless they are being denied access altogether. We have seen the stories of essentially really underscoring the fact that abortion bans have made pregnancy more dangerous. The story of Kate Cox, who tried to get out of Texas or tried to get her abortion in Texas as she was facing a significant medical condition in December. We also know now that they are willing to criminalize miscarriage, as if we had any thought that they might actually be more humane. Just looking at the story of Brittany Watts in Ohio, who experienced a miscarriage and was reported by her nurse. You know, and face time and incarceration. The idea that we have now come, I guess it was, I don't know, it was just 2 weeks ago, Alabama, the Supreme Court in Alabama determined that embryos are now children, frozen embryos are now children. And so the consequences, the ripple effect of abortion bans, not just on actually denying people access to abortion health care, but really through pregnancy, through miscarriage, through IVF, that, you know, we no longer are able to make a decision as to whether, when we get pregnant, but also now how. We are also, just quickly, seeing the fatigue on the provider side. The providers, many of you may have seen last year, or I think this July actually, the match into medical schools in banned states. There was a 10% decline of OBGYNs going into banned states. We are seeing a ripple out of particularly OBs who have high risk practice and experience because they are worried about potential criminalization in state. And we're talking about criminalization that could carry 99 years of prison or $100,000 fines and loss of licensure. So they're making decisions to retire or to move to other states. Labor and delivery units are closing in Idaho, and I think in Georgia, I know Stacey was here, they only had 50% of their counties had OBGYNs in them. So just the infrastructure that is really losing access to talent, the impact that it's having obviously on workforce and families, as well as providers, is pretty significant right now.
And you mentioned a couple of stories that ripple to the top that Planned Parenthood have been very good at getting out, but there's many other stories that we don't hear. And the ripple effect that you talk about, it's really economically, what happens to the women that can't afford to travel?
Well, I mean, you know, a story just from Planned Parenthood this summer. We had a patient who woke up in Georgia pregnant, didn't want to be, and made an appointment in South Carolina. She got to South Carolina, and that day, the 6-week ban went into effect. So she had to travel back to Georgia. She made an appointment later in Florida. You know, a few weeks later, by the time she could get the appointment and get up the money, because every time she's making these appointments, she's got to find childcare, she's got to take time off from work, she's got to get money up for a trip. And then she got to Florida the same day that the ban went into effect there, or just after, and didn't realize because of the chaos and the confusion. And so quickly had to get on a plane and fly to California because she had now gone too far into being able to get access to a medication abortion. And just the toll, right? There's the indignity of like having to go through that, you know, experience. I think those are the stories that we continue to hear, but with abortion funds, with access to, you know, justice funds, funds that Planned Parenthood can offer, we were able to support. But that is not obviously the story that is reaching everyone. There's plenty of stories that we see of forced pregnancies, and that is also by design.
Jen, how important is this issue for the administration?
It's incredibly important because it's incredibly important to the American people, not just women, but obviously particularly women. And, you know, we, from the day the Dobbs decision came down, the president and the vice president were quite clear, first of all, that this was completely contrary to what people want. I mean, the vast majority, it's not a small majority, it's a vast majority of people believe that Roe was rightly decided. As you said, it was nearly 50 years precedent, and that it shouldn't have been overturned. And so, you know, day one of Dobbs, actually 45 minutes after the Dobbs decision came down, you know, we had obviously been preparing for it, but the president went out and talked about how the only way to restore the right that was lost is to pass federal legislation that would restore Roe. And he has been clear-eyed and visionary about that. I have to say, personally, I was sort of frustrated when he said that. You know, literally 45 minutes, it's like, that's going to take a while. We need to do more now. And that's what we've proceeded to do is, you know, keep that North Star, that vision of where we need to go and how we need to get there, but also do everything we can by executive action. And in the states, I mean, you know, Alexis just vividly described what is happening. And the states are really, I keep referring to them as the front lines. So one other piece of what we've done, and I can talk more about the executive action we've taken, but working with state legislators, governors, friendly attorneys general across the country about what they can do, not only to help citizens of their own states, but citizens of states who've just, you know, are living in those 21 states with the abortion bans in place.
What was the reaction to the Alabama judgment 2 weeks ago? How did the administration take that?
Well, I think, you know, as Alexis started to talk about, you need to first take a minute to think about what is happening on the ground. So you have patients who literally, some in the middle of a cycle of getting in vitro fertilization, who don't know whether they can have their embryos transplanted. People who don't know what will happen to the embryos that they have already produced that are waiting. And, you know, so the reaction was, you know, this is, first of all, completely predictable as the result of the chaos and confusion that was created when Roe was overturned, but also, you know, some level of shock. I mean, it's like, first they wanted to take away the right to choose when and whether to have a child, and now they're taking away the right to choose to have one and how you're going to have it. I mean, you just said that. And so I think, you know, we first went after the right to abortion, then they went after the right to contraception, and now the right to use IVF or other fertility treatments.
Is there a worst case scenario and what's next? Oh, I mean, it's terrifying, no?
No, I mean, you know, I think we've seen many of the things that can happen. And as again, I think it's really important to point out that this is all a direct consequence, a completely predictable and direct consequence of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And we know who's responsible for that. I think that, there are things we can do, and this is what we're doing in the administration. Number one, protecting access to medication abortion. Number two, protecting access to contraception. Number three, protecting patient privacy, because a lot of patients are, very concerned that they will be prosecuted, their doctors will be prosecuted, and we have tools, we have federal laws that protect the most sensitive health information. We're using those. Protecting patient safety and security when they seek services, whether that's picking up a prescription at a pharmacy, because the exciting news last week was that 2 major retail pharmacy chains are now going to make medication abortion, mifepristone, available in their pharmacies. We need
it's like a little win in the, yeah, exactly.
And I actually think it's worth pointing out that there are more than little wins. There are really big wins. And so yes, while the biggest win we need to keep fighting for, which is to pass federal legislation to restore the protections of Roe, there are things we can do. And we now see that, they've gone too far. I mean, you see the Alabama state legislature falling all over themselves to try to pass a piece of legislation, which they presumably will do even this week. Now, that piece of legislation leaves a lot of questions, and whether you can remove your embryos from the state of Alabama, whether you can continue to store your embryos, those questions are not answered. So that's not solving the problem that's in Alabama. But there are things we can do, and I think the motivation is there because people are mad and are taking action.
Did you see different people getting mad over Alabama versus Dobbs?
Yes, I think Alabama really. To your point, it's beyond. So obviously abortion has been a fairly controversial issue in the United States, maybe more in the United States than in other places. I actually think it's way less controversial than it used to be. As I said, I think the strong majority of Americans, not just Democrats, not just women, but independents and Republicans, actually believe that there should be a right to make these choices yourselves about your own body. And I think we've crossed a line where this is no longer an issue where people are dramatically opposed to each other and to have different views. I think there's a strong middle where people actually agree. But I think what just happened in Alabama and the court case, which reads like we live in a theocracy, really motivated some people who maybe weren't even paying attention.
Yeah, I agree. Sarah, taking it global, your work focuses on improving the availability and quality of sexual reproductive health in countries where the health system has been weakened by war or natural disaster. What you're seeing happening in the US, how has that had a ripple effect beyond?
Unfortunately, we're seeing attacks on reproductive rights in the US having a profound effect on reproductive rights in the global South. Sort of the success of the anti-choice movement here in the Supreme Court has emboldened anti-choice movements around the world and threatens local advancement in sexual and reproductive health and rights. They say the US did it, why can't we? Now, I have to say, we're seeing a lot of funding from the religious right here going to fund anti-choice movements, both local and regional movements around the global South. And they use similar tactics to pull back. Let's take Kenya for an example. The growing influence of the anti-rights movement in Kenya has slowed progress on addressing unsafe abortion, which is one of the major causes of maternal death and disability in the country. They had high court rulings in 2019 and 2022 that affirmed abortion is a fundamental right under their 2010 constitution and directed Parliament to enact reforms to make it accessible. However, under backlash from the anti-choice movements, the Attorney General has stayed the ruling, which also partly relied on Roe v. Wade in the ruling. They, in addition, they've also funded, we're trying to put in a family planning law that would enact the framework under which sexual reproductive health access in Kenya would be expanded in accordance with their local laws, but anti-choice movements largely funded by the US ended up causing that to be withdrawn.
Funded from where in the US?
A lot of the religious right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And staying globally, I'm Irish, I grew up in Ireland, and I wrote my editor's letter in 2018 about repeal the 8th Amendment. I was so proud to grow up in a country that had finally given women back their access to reproductive rights. And I wrote in that editor's letter how I was terrified that I lived in a country that was taking it away. Where is our standing globally when it comes to this, Jen? Like, where do we stand? We see France today, as Alexis brought up. I just want to use the exact language because it's so empowering. They enshrined into their constitution what was it, Alexis?
Guaranteed freedom.
Guaranteed freedom. We were celebrating backstage in the green room about this. The guaranteed freedom into their constitution for women to have an abortion. The rest of the world, at least most of them, seem to be going forward. We're going back. How is that affects our standing in the world when it comes to this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a concern. And, you know, I hear that when I go to the UN and talk to people from other countries, representatives from other countries, and they say, first of all, what's happening over there? But second of all, it does have ripple effects in other countries. I will say, hopefully, that, you know, in the last 30 years, 60 countries have taken action on reproductive rights. And all of them, other than 4, have taken steps forward. The 4, sadly, are the United States, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Poland. So we're not in great company. The rest of the world really is making steps in the right direction, and we have very sadly taken steps back. So I think our standing is questionable, but I think that, you know, at the same time, when you look at the future that's ahead, I somehow remain optimistic. I do remain optimistic that we are actually going to see forward motion in this country, partly because of the anger and the sort of, you know, shock that we fell into when the Dobbs decision came down.
And talking about forward motion, Alexis, you have spent a lot of time, and you will for the next couple of months, out on a campaign trail, talking to voters. What has what happened to reproductive rights in the US meant for ballot initiatives, for voters? What are you seeing?
What I'm seeing is every time reproductive freedom is on the ballot, we win, bar none. I mean, and in places where you don't expect to win, right? So we're talking Kansas and Kentucky, Michigan, Montana, Ohio, Wisconsin, you know, like states that may be purple, states that are, you know, 100%, you know, clearly supportive of reproductive freedom. And I think, you know, Jen's argument around or polling data, I think is so important, right? Because you have 85% of Americans believing that we should have reproductive freedom, and yet to have 21 states roll those rights back, what it really does is help people understand that our democracy is not functioning. And so all of the ways in which we have seen reproductive rights kind of move backwards here, I think also correlates to, you know, the number of countries, right, that have that are descending into fascism, and the way in which the authoritarian tendencies in this country are coming to bear. And that has, I think, been the most interesting thing that I've seen on the campaign trail, right? The fact that people are, you know, there's a reason why abortion and democracy were the closing arguments of 22. There's a reason why they are the closing, you know, what I imagine will be the closing argument this year, because it's also helping people understand, right, that democracy starts at the local level, right? That it's going to matter who your, you know, who your prosecutor is, who your DA is. Are they going to enforce these laws? It's going to matter who your state Supreme Court, you know, candidate is. You know, how many of us can name who's sitting on the state Supreme Court right now in New York State? I think all of the ways in which, you know, we have seen that rage, fuel, and drive, I think is so important. And this IVF, just to go back quickly to your conversation around IVF, you know, the opposition has been so successful separating abortion from reproductive health care, right? Just trying to keep it out here at its island, and really only elective abortion, right? They've tried to separate it out in this way. But what we have seen now, right, is that pregnancies are more dangerous. We've seen the miscarriage being criminalized. And now with IVF, people are being able to, you know, kind of understand that abortion is part of sexual and reproductive freedom, right? Having access to medical care is a private medical decision that you want to make. You don't want, you know, you don't want Marjorie Taylor Greene to make those decisions, right? You don't want Ted Cruz to make those decisions for you. You want to be able to make those decisions yourself. And I think that is actually what is resonating across the board for people across party, across demographics, across states. And I think that's actually the powerful thing that we continue to drive forward on.
And I do think in a way, and Glamour partnered with GQ a couple of years ago to try to tell men's abortion story, because I think we're 4 women on this stage talking about reproductive rights, but the fight for that is a universal one, it's a genderless one, and we don't hear from the men half as much as we should when it comes to that fight. And what's interesting, I think, from Alabama is we've heard from lots more men that are trying to create families, and men going through IVF with their partners, more involved in maybe that fight than they were previous to that. And on that, I'm going to wrap up and ask you all, what can the audience listening in person or at home, what can they do to help stop the erosion of our reproductive rights, either here in the US or globally? Sara, I'll start with you.
I have 2 things. For donors, commit to unrestricted, consistent funding to grassroots feminist organizations around the world in the global South who are the leaders in fighting for the advancement of sexual and reproductive rights around the country. And I would say here, for those who can vote, push your representatives to pass the Global HER Act, which would prevent the US government from reintroducing the global gag rule, which removes fundings from organizations working on sexual and reproductive health around the world.
Alexis?
Yes. So I would say 2 things as well. I would say, first of all, as gloom and doom as we started off this conversation, I really do hold a lot of hope right now, and hope needs an infrastructure, right? It needs to be supported. It needs, everyone who is calling into a health center who needs an appointment, there's somebody on the other side of that needs to be supported to make sure that they are able to do the work to ensure that the care is provided, that they're fighting the bad bills, and the funds are there. So supporting abortion funds, supporting local independent providers and local Planned Parenthood affiliates, I think is critically important. But the voting piece and the long game voting piece, I think, is the thing that we really need to pay attention to. 24 is going to be an incredibly important year, and I know that is like the understatement of the universe. But to be able to move forward, to Jen's point, to get to a governing majority for reproductive freedom, it will actually give us our first bite at the apple for federal legislation. And that is very, very exciting, and it should be mobilizing and energizing. But we will need to continue to fight ballot initiatives like the one in Florida and the one in New York that has language in it that could help us actually get to a guaranteed freedom for the next court in the next 15 years. And so I think it's really important for us to stay engaged and vote, but also really start to engage in a long-term strategy to get back into the Constitution, because that's really what our work is now, generationally.
Thank you. Jen, I'll leave the final word to you and the administration.
And I'm not allowed to say the words vote, 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 but I will say that from my current position. But I will say that, what we've seen in those ballot initiatives that Alexis raised earlier is that when people organize and make their voices heard, we see the result. And that every time reproductive freedom has been on the ballot, we win. So organize. I mean, Michigan is a perfect example of that. They organized, they really brought people out, and the results were clear. And even in smaller ways. So if you're not an organizer, you're not going to get out and bring others with you. Just make your own voice heard, because it matters that you have people who represent you, who reflect your values and the policies that you want to see in place.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies. Sara, Alexis, Jen, thank you.